The scorching Texas heat shimmered off the hard-packed earth as dust kicked up in angry clouds, each particle catching the afternoon sunlight like tiny golden daggers. Inside the circular corral, a massive black stallion moved with the fluid grace of liquid lightning, his powerful muscles rippling beneath a coal-black coat that seemed to absorb every ray of sunshine that dared touch him. Storm was his name, and for 3 long, brutal years running, he had lived up to every single letter of that tempestuous moniker. His eyes blazed with the wild, untamed fury of the open plains that stretched endlessly beyond the ranch boundaries, and his magnificent spirit remained as defiant and unconquerable as the day he first drew breath on this unforgiving Texas landscape. Every movement spoke of barely contained violence, every breath carried the promise of chaos, and every step seemed calculated to remind anyone watching that some things in this world simply refused to be broken, no matter how much money, time, or determination was thrown at them. Standing outside the weathered arena, his calloused forearms resting against the sun-bleached oak railing that had witnessed countless battles between man and beast, William Thornton surveyed his vast empire with the calculating, predatory gaze of a man who had clawed his way up from absolute nothing to build a cattle kingdom that stretched further than the eye could see. His custom-made ostrich leather boots, worth more than most people's monthly salary, bore the accumulated dust and grime of 1,000 grueling cattle drives across unforgiving terrain. His weathered, scarred hands told wordless stories of billion-dollar deals struck in smoky backrooms and fortunes made through sheer force of will, and an almost supernatural ability to sense weakness in both animals and men. The Thornton Ranch sprawled across 15,000 prime acres of the finest Texas real estate money could buy, complete with oil wells that pumped liquid gold from deep beneath the scorched earth. But today, every ounce of his legendary focus centered on the one thing his vast fortune couldn't purchase, couldn't negotiate for, and couldn't intimidate into submission: the complete and total surrender of this magnificent, terrifying beast that had become his personal obsession. Pete Morrison, his grizzled foreman of 23 years, stood nearby, spitting tobacco juice into the parched dirt with practiced accuracy. The brown stain joined dozens of others that marked the spots where he'd stood witness to Storm's reign of terror. The stories he could tell would make grown men shudder. That fancy bronc rider from Oklahoma City, the one with all the championship belt buckles and magazine covers, had been thrown so hard and so far he practically landed in the next county. It took 2 ambulances and a helicopter to get him out of there. The cocky fellow from Montana wouldn't be riding anything more challenging than a rocking chair for the next 6 months if he was lucky. The doctor said his spine got compressed like an accordion, and that fool from California, who claimed he could speak to horses with his mind, had learned that Storm spoke back with authority, telling him in no uncertain terms to get off his back and stay off. William had seen them all come and go. Professional riders with championship buckles, rodeo legends with more titles than they could count, even specialists who claimed they could tame any animal. Storm had sent them all packing, and most left with bruises that would remind them of their failure for months to come. The horse wasn't just difficult or dangerous, he seemed to take personal offense to anyone who dared climb onto his back, and he had developed a particular talent for finding creative and painful ways to remove unwanted passengers. That morning, William made an announcement that would echo throughout the ranching community for years to come. He was putting up $50,000 cash money to anyone who could stay on Storm's back for 8 seconds. Not tame him, mind you. Just stay on. The ranch hands exchanged nervous glances when they heard the amount. $50,000 was more money than most of them saw in 2 years combined. It was also, they knew from bitter experience, money that would likely stay in the boss's pocket. Storm wasn't just difficult, he was downright dangerous, and everyone who worked the ranch had witnessed firsthand what happened to men who underestimated him. Word of the challenge spread faster than wildfire in drought season. It started with Pete mentioning it to his brother-in-law at the local diner, continued when the waitress overheard and told her regular customers, and by sunset, the news had reached every bar, barbershop, and general store within 100 miles. $50,000 for 8 seconds of work sounded too good to be true, which, given Storm's reputation, it probably was. 300 grueling miles away, in the suffocating shadow of Dallas's towering concrete and steel monuments to corporate power, a completely different kind of survival story played out in the unforgiving urban wilderness that most people preferred to pretend didn't exist. 12-year-old Jake Martinez had learned to navigate the brutal street maze with the same razor-sharp instincts that had once guided his long-dead ancestors across the harsh southwestern deserts in search of water, food, and safety. The mean streets had been his only home for as long as his fragmented memory could stretch back, and the unforgiving urban environment had forced him to develop a particular set of survival skills absolutely necessary for such a dangerous existence. He had mastered the art of becoming completely invisible. When predators prowled nearby, developed the sudden boldness required when opportunity presented itself for just a split second, and possessed an almost supernatural sixth sense that allowed him to detect potential danger or unexpected chances for advancement in the most unlikely and overlooked places. Through trial and often painful error, he had learned which dumpsters behind which restaurants yielded the freshest discarded food, which police officers would chase him away, and which ones might occasionally slip him a few dollars or a sandwich. Which street corners offered the best opportunities for washing windshields without getting arrested, and which abandoned buildings provided the safest shelter when the Texas storms rolled through with their devastating fury. On this particular evening, Jake crouched behind a grease-stained dumpster outside a truck stop, listening to two drivers arguing about the best route to Austin. But it wasn't their conversation about highways and delivery schedules that made his heart suddenly start pounding like a war drum. It was the casual mention of a crazy rich rancher out in Cedar Creek who was offering 50 grand to anyone who could ride his horse for 8 seconds. The drivers spoke of a horse that was pure evil, all black and mean as a rattlesnake, one that had thrown off some big-shot rodeo star in under 30 seconds. Jake's entire world shifted in that moment. $50,000. The number seemed impossible, like something from a dream or a movie. He had never owned more than $20 at one time in his entire life. With that kind of money, he could do anything. Buy food without scavenging through garbage, sleep somewhere safe without constantly watching over his shoulder, maybe even go to school like regular kids, learn to read properly, have a real future, instead of just surviving day to day. That night, huddled in his usual spot beneath the highway overpass, where the constant rumble of traffic provided a strange kind of comfort, Jake stared up at the stars, barely visible through the orange glow of city lights. He had never been on a horse, barely knew which end was which, but something deep in his chest told him this was different. This wasn't about riding skills or experience or any of the things that usually mattered. Sometimes he had learned through his harsh existence on the streets, the most impossible things happened to the people. Everyone overlooked the ones society had written off as worthless. The next morning, as the first pale fingers of dawn crept across the Dallas skyline, Jake began his seemingly impossible journey, with nothing but the threadbare clothes clinging to his back, a cracked plastic water bottle containing maybe 8 ounces of questionable liquid, and a determination so fierce it surprised even him with its intensity. He hitched rides whenever he could convince a driver to take pity on a kid who looked like he hadn't eaten a decent meal in weeks, walked endless miles on burning asphalt when he couldn't, and collapsed into exhausted sleep wherever the merciful darkness of night finally found his aching body. The journey became a blur of truck stops, reeking of diesel fuel and stale coffee, highway shoulders littered with the detritus of modern life, and the occasional act of kindness from strangers who saw something in his determined eyes that reminded them of their own children or their younger selves. Some truck drivers, their hearts softened by thoughts of their own kids safe at home, occasionally took pity on the small, stubborn figure with his thumb stuck out hopefully beside the endless ribbon of asphalt, though most roared past without even slowing down their drivers, too focused on delivery schedules and profit margins to notice one more casualty of an unforgiving world. Jake learned to read license plates from a distance, distinguishing between local drivers who might show mercy and long-distance haulers who had hardened their hearts against roadside sob stories. He discovered which rest stops had the cleanest public restrooms and which gas stations would let him refill his water bottle without calling security. 3 days and 200 miles later, his shoes had completely disintegrated, leaving his feet bloody and blistered, but his resolve had only grown stronger with each painful step. Cedar Creek turned out to be one of those towns that existed mainly as a place to buy gas and grab a sandwich, before continuing to somewhere more important. The Thornton Ranch lay another 12 miles beyond the town limits, down a dusty road that seemed to stretch toward the horizon like a personal challenge to anyone brave or foolish enough to accept it. The massive wooden arch marking the ranch entrance stood 20 feet wide and twice as tall, with the ranch name burned into the timber in letters that could be seen from a quarter-mile away. 2 security guards sat in the shade of a small booth, both looking like they had been hired more for intimidation than customer service. When Jake approached on foot, dusty and obviously homeless, their expressions made it clear they found his presence less than welcome. The larger guard rose from his chair with obvious reluctance, already shaking his head before Jake even spoke. The conversation was brief and predictable. Jake explained why he was there. The guards burst into harsh laughter that seemed to echo off the surrounding hills, and they firmly told him to go home before he got hurt. But Jake had no home to return to, and they all knew it from looking at him. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, his hair needed cutting, and his entire worldly possessions probably could have fit in a grocery bag. Still, something in his eyes refused to accept defeat. When they told him to leave, he simply sat down in the sparse shade of a nearby mesquite tree and made it clear he wasn't going anywhere. For the next 4 days, Jake maintained his vigil outside the ranch gates. He slept under the stars, drank from a stream that ran along the road, and survived on the occasional handout from passing motorists who took pity on his obvious situation. The guards grew increasingly irritated with his presence, but he never caused trouble, never begged, and never gave up. He just waited with the patience of someone who had learned that good things rarely came quickly and that persistence often succeeded where talent failed. On the 5th morning, William Thornton himself drove through the gates and noticed the small figure still camped nearby. Something about the boy's persistence sparked his curiosity. He had built his fortune by recognizing determination when he saw it, and this kid had it in spades. After a brief conversation with his head of security about the stubborn kid who had been camping outside for 5 days straight, William made a decision that would change 2 lives forever. 10 minutes later, Jake found himself standing in the largest room he had ever seen, surrounded by leather furniture that probably cost more than most people made in a year. William Thornton sat behind a desk the size of a small aircraft carrier, his weathered hands folded as he studied his unexpected visitor with the calculating gaze of a man who had learned to read people like books. The conversation that followed was brief but revelatory. Jake admitted he had never been on a horse before, acknowledged that he knew the animal had put 4 men in the hospital in recent months, but insisted he still had to try. There was something in the boy's voice that reminded William of himself at that age, the desperate hunger of someone with nothing to lose and everything to gain. Against his better judgment, William decided to give Jake a chance, making it crystal clear that if Storm hurt him, the responsibility would be entirely his own. That night, Jake barely slept. He had been granted his chance, but now the reality of what he faced began to sink in like a stone dropped into deep water. He had seen Storm from a distance during his vigil, a black shadow moving with barely contained violence within the corral. The horse was massive, probably weighing as much as a small car, and every story he had heard suggested the animal possessed both the will and ability to seriously injure anyone foolish enough to climb on his back. Dawn came sooner than Jake wanted, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. He arrived at the ranch house to find William already waiting, dressed in work clothes and looking every inch the cattleman who had built an empire from dust and determination. After one final confirmation that Jake was sure about his decision, they walked together toward the corral that would determine the boy's fate. The walk felt both endless and far too short. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as they approached the wooden fence surrounding the arena. Inside, Storm paced like a caged tiger, his black coat gleaming with nervous sweat, his eyes wild and watchful. The horse was even more impressive up close, easily 17 hands high with muscles that spoke of power and speed in equal measure. William observed that the stallion knew something was different today, that horses sense things humans don't, and Storm definitely knew someone was coming for him. A small crowd had gathered, word having spread among the ranch hands that the homeless kid was actually going to attempt the impossible. They lined the fence like spectators at a hanging their faces, showing mixtures of curiosity, pity, and the barely concealed excitement that comes from watching someone else take a dangerous risk. Most of them had witnessed Storm's previous encounters with would-be riders, and they expected this one to end even more quickly and violently than the others. The gate swung open with a squeal of hinges that seemed loud enough to wake the dead. Jake stepped into the arena, and immediately Storm's attention locked onto him with laser intensity. The horse stopped pacing and stood perfectly still, every muscle tensed, studying this new challenger with calculating intelligence that seemed almost human in its intensity. For several heart-stopping seconds that seemed to stretch into eternity, neither boy nor magnificent beast dared to move so much as a muscle. Jake found himself staring directly into Storm's wild, intelligent eyes and seeing something that struck him like a physical blow, something he recognized from his own reflection in store windows and broken mirrors during his years on the streets. It was the bone-deep wariness of a creature that had learned through bitter experience never to trust another living soul, the barely controlled fury of something beautiful and proud that had been pushed far beyond its breaking point too many times to count. In that profound moment of mutual recognition, Jake understood with crystal clarity that Storm wasn't just a difficult or dangerous horse that needed to be broken and controlled. He was a prisoner of magnificent proportions, proud and defiant, and desperately hungry for anyone to see him as more than just an expensive problem that needed to be solved through force and intimidation. The stallion's nostrils flared as he took in Jake's scent, his powerful muscles tensed beneath that gleaming black coat, every instinct screaming at him to attack this latest challenger before the inevitable pain and humiliation could begin. But something in the boy's complete stillness, something in the way he didn't brandish ropes or spurs, or any of the tools that had caused Storm so much suffering over the years, made the great horse pause and truly look at what stood before him. Instead of approaching directly with the arrogant confidence that had characterized every other challenger, Jake did something that shocked everyone watching. He sat down in the dirt. The movement was so unexpected that Storm actually took a step backward, ears swiveling forward with confusion. In all his encounters with humans, none had ever simply sat down and waited. They came at him with ropes and saddles, with spurs and whips, with the arrogant assumption that he existed for their convenience. This was different. This was respectful. This was patient. Jake remained motionless, barely breathing, letting Storm make the next move. Minutes passed in tense silence. The horse moved closer, then farther away, testing, learning, trying to understand this strange new dynamic. Jake could hear whispered conversations from the spectators along the fence, but he blocked them out completely. Right now, nothing existed except him and this magnificent animal who had been hurt and misunderstood by everyone who had tried to break him. Slowly, so slowly that the movement was barely perceptible, Storm approached. He stretched his powerful, neck-forward nostrils flaring as he took in Jake's scent, searching for any hint of the violence and dominance that had characterized every previous encounter. Still, the boy didn't move. The horse came closer, until Jake could feel the warmth of breath on his hair, could sense the enormous power held in check just inches away. Then, with infinite care and respect, Jake raised one hand and placed it gently on Storm's nose. The horse didn't pull away. For the first time in 3 years, Storm allowed a human to touch him without restraints, without force, without fear. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, as if time itself had slowed down. To witness this impossible moment, Jake rose to his feet with movements so gradual they seemed like meditation, each gesture carefully calculated to maintain the fragile trust that was building between them. He ran his hand along Storm's neck, speaking in whispers too soft for anyone else to hear, words of understanding and respect that the horse seemed to comprehend on some primal level. When Jake placed his hands on Storm's back, the watchers along the fence held their collective breath. This was the moment when every other rider had been thrown, usually with spectacular and painful violence. But Storm stood perfectly still, as if he were carved from black marble, his eyes calm for the first time since he had arrived at the ranch. Jake swung his leg over the horse's back and settled into position. For 8 seconds, that stretched like hours. Boy and horse remained motionless in the center of the arena. No bucking, no wild fury, no desperate attempt to remove the rider, just profound stillness, as if both had found something they had been searching for without knowing it. The silence was so complete that the sound of the wind through the fence posts seemed deafening. When Jake finally slid down from Storm's back, the silence was absolute. William Thornton stood with his mouth slightly open, his weathered hands gripping the fence rail until his knuckles showed white. In 40 years of working with horses, he had never seen anything like what he had just witnessed. The ranch hands stood frozen in place, unable to process what they had seen. Some rubbed their eyes, wondering if the Texas heat had caused them to hallucinate. Jake walked slowly back to the gate, his legs trembling slightly with leftover adrenaline. Storm watched him go, then resumed his pacing, but with less agitation than before. Something fundamental had changed in those 8 seconds, though nobody could quite put their finger on what. The horse that had been a symbol of untamable rage was somehow calmer, as if a weight had been lifted from his spirit. William met Jake at the gate, his expression unreadable. In all his years of business dealings, he had rarely been surprised, but what he had just witnessed defied every expectation and challenged everything he thought he knew about horses and human nature. The boy had accomplished something that professional riders with decades of experience had failed to achieve, and he had done it not through strength or technique, but through something far more rare and valuable. When Jake asked about the money, the question seemed almost anticlimactic after what had just occurred. William confirmed that he had more than earned it, but before writing the check, he asked what Jake planned to do with $50,000. The boy's answer was simple and heartbreaking. Find somewhere to live, get some real food, maybe go to school. William nodded slowly, recognizing in those modest dreams the echo of his own desperate youth. Instead of writing a check, he made an offer. That would transform both their lives. He invited Jake to stay on the ranch, offering him a room in the house, 3 meals a day, enrollment in the local school, and a chance to work with Storm and the other horses. For the first time since William had known him, Jake's composure cracked slightly, his eyes growing bright as he struggled to maintain his voice. As they walked back toward the house, Storm watched from the corral, and for the first time in 3 years, the great black stallion seemed almost peaceful. The boy had seen him not as something to be conquered, but as something to be understood, and that recognition had made all the difference. In the weeks and months that followed that transformative morning, Jake Martinez underwent a complete metamorphosis that amazed everyone who witnessed it. He transformed from a nameless, homeless street kid who most people looked right through, without seeing, into one of the most gifted and intuitive horse whisperers that anyone in the entire state of Texas had ever encountered. His natural ability with horses seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, as if his traumatic past had somehow prepared him to understand and connect with animals that had also been hurt and abandoned by the world. Storm became not just his greatest triumph, but his closest companion and most trusted friend. The once violent stallion followed Jake around the ranch like an enormous, devoted dog, responding to subtle hand signals and whispered commands that no one else could even hear, much less understand. William Thornton watched this unlikely partnership develop with growing amazement and a respect that deepened each time he witnessed Jake work his quiet magic with horses that other trainers had written off as hopeless cases. The boy possessed a gift that couldn't be taught in any school or learned from any book, an almost mystical ability to see past an animal's defensive anger and violent behavior to the frightened, hurting creature underneath. Within 6 months, Jake had not only completely rehabilitated Storm, but had also worked similar miracles with 3 other horses that had been considered dangerous and worthless. Word began to spread throughout the ranching community about the mysterious kid at the Thornton place who could tame any horse, no matter how wild or traumatized it might be. Offers began pouring in from other ranchers, some offering thousands of dollars for just a few days of Jake's time with their problem, animals. But Jake never asked for money, and William never pressured him to take on more than he was comfortable handling. The boy had found something far more valuable than any amount of cash could provide: a sense of purpose, a place where he belonged, and the knowledge that his difficult past had prepared him for something truly extraordinary. He never did ask for that $50,000 that had started this whole adventure, having discovered something worth infinitely more. He had found a home, a family, a future, and the unshakable knowledge that sometimes the most miraculous things happen when you simply have the courage and patience to sit down, be still, and wait for magic to find you. In a world that had taught him that he was worthless and invisible, he had discovered that his greatest strength lay not in fighting against the current, but in understanding it, working with it, and finding peace in the eye of the storm.